The lawyer's voice cuts through the room like a blade through silk, and I watch my son's face twist into that familiar smirk, the one that's always made my stomach turn. Graham leans back in his leather chair, one arm draped over the armrest like he's already claimed his throne, and beside him, Vivian's lips curl into something that might pass for a smile if you didn't know better. To my beloved wife Eleanor, Mr. Harrington reads, his grey eyes steady over his reading glasses, I leave the greenhouse and all its plants. The explosion of laughter hits me like a physical blow. Graham slaps the mahogany table so hard the water glasses jump. Vivian throws her head back, that high-pitched cackle of hers filling every corner of Harold's study, our study, the room where my husband spent 40 years building what they think is theirs. See. Graham's voice booms across to me, loud enough that even the relatives in the back rows can hear. Told you, Mother. You get the plants. He's actually pointing at me now, tears of laughter streaking down his face. We get the house, the business, the real estate portfolio, everything that actually matters. And you. He pauses for effect, playing to his audience. You get to keep playing in the dirt. The room roars again. Cousin Margaret is dabbing her eyes. Uncle Robert is shaking with silent laughter. Even some of Harold's old business partners are grinning behind their hands. Vivian leans over and stage whispers something to Graham's ear, and they both dissolve into fresh fits of laughter. My face burns. My hands, folded in my lap, are trembling, but I keep them still. I've had 78 years of practice keeping still, keeping quiet, letting them think whatever they want to think. The greenhouse. The plants. Poor Eleanor, always with her flowers, never understanding the real world of commerce and power. If you were in my shoes right now, watching your own son mock you at your husband's funeral, would you stay quiet or speak up? Would you let them laugh, or would you fight back? Let me tell you something about underestimation. It's the sharpest weapon you can wield if you know how to use it. While they're laughing at you, dismissing you, writing you off as harmless, you can build empires in the shadows. You can plant seeds they'll never see coming until the roots break through concrete. Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family, enjoy the story. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You need to understand how I got here, sitting in this room full of vultures, watching my only child celebrate what he thinks is my humiliation. You need to know about Harold, about the early days, about the promises made in darkness that no one else witnessed. You need to know about Graham's transformation from the sweet boy who used to help me water the roses to this stranger, who looks at me like I'm nothing more than an obstacle between him and his inheritance. Mr. Harrington clears his throat. It's a small sound, barely audible over the dying chuckles still echoing through the room, but something in it makes my spine straighten. I've known Robert Harrington for 30 years. He was Harold's lawyer, yes, but he was also our friend. He knows things. He knows everything. The laughter starts to fade as people notice the lawyer hasn't moved on to the next item. He's just standing there, one hand still on the will document, the other adjusting his glasses in that precise way he has. Graham's still grinning, but there's a flicker of something else crossing his face now, confusion maybe, or the first whisper of unease. If I may, Mr. Harrington says, his voice carrying that particular tone lawyers use when they're about to drop a bomb. There appears to be some misunderstanding about the estate. Vivian stops mid-laugh. The sound cuts off so abruptly it leaves a ringing silence in its wake. What misunderstanding? Graham's voice has lost its jovial edge. He sits forward, and I can see the businessman in him now, the man who thinks he's been running Whitmore Holdings for the past 5 years. The will is clear. Mother gets the greenhouse, we get the actual assets. Mr. Harrington's lips press into a thin line. He looks down at the papers in front of him, then back up at Graham. Then, almost apologetically, his eyes find mine. There's something in his gaze, respect, maybe, or vindication. In that moment, I know he remembers the day 30 years ago when Harold brought me to his office, when we set up the arrangements, when we protected what was mine. The businesses, Mr. Harrington says slowly, deliberately, letting each word land like a stone dropping into still water, while built and managed by Harold Whitmore, were not legally registered in his name. The room goes absolutely silent. You could hear a pin drop. You could hear hearts starting to race, breaths catching in throats. Graham's smirk is frozen on his face like a mask someone forgot to take off. What do you mean, not in his name? That's impossible. Whitmore Holdings was, Dad's company. Everyone knows that. Everyone, Mr. Harrington continues, and now there's steel in his voice, assumes many things. But legal documentation tells a different story. He lifts another folder, this one thicker than the first. Whitmore Holdings' primary assets, including the logistics division, the supply chain network, the real estate holdings, and the intellectual property rights, are registered under Eleanor Whitmore's name. They have been since 1972. I watch the color drain from Graham's face. Vivian's mouth falls open, and for once in her life, she has nothing to say. Which means, Mr. Harrington concludes, his words falling into the shocked silence like thunder, those businesses were never Harold's to distribute. They were never yours, Graham. The room explodes, but this time it's not laughter, it's chaos, confusion, angry voices overlapping. Graham is on his feet, shouting something about mistakes and fraud. Vivian's shrill voice cuts through, demanding explanations. Relatives are whispering frantically to each other, and Uncle Robert looks like he might faint. And me? I sit perfectly still, my hands still folded in my lap, my face carefully neutral. Inside, though, something is blooming. Something that's been growing in the dark for 50 years, fed by every dismissive comment, every mocking laugh, every time they looked through me like I was invisible. Justice, I've learned, doesn't need rage. It doesn't need shouting or drama. It just needs patience. It needs roots that grow deep and quiet, where no one thinks to look. But the story of how those roots got planted, that starts decades ago, in a different world, with a young woman who thought love was enough and a man who made promises in the dark. I need to take you back before I can take you forward. Back to when I was just Eleanor Hayes, 23 years old, standing in front of a classroom of restless third graders in Pittsburgh, completely unaware that my entire life was about to change. It was September 1968. The world was on fire that year, riots in the streets, protests on every campus, everything my parents' generation believed in being torn apart and rebuilt. But in my little classroom on Maple Street, we still said the Pledge of Allegiance every morning, and I still believed that if you worked hard and loved deeply, everything would turn out fine. That's how naive I was. I met Harold at a fundraiser for the school library. He walked in wearing a suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and I remember thinking he looked completely out of place among the teachers and local shop owners. He was 31 then, 8 years older than me, and he had this energy about him, like he was always moving forward, always reaching for something just beyond his grasp. "You're the teacher everyone's talking about," he said, appearing beside me at the punch bowl. His voice was smooth, confident. "Eleanor Hayes. The one who got the Thompson kid to stop throwing chairs." I laughed, surprised he'd heard about that. I just listened to him. Nobody else had bothered. "Exactly." Harold's eyes, sharp and blue as winter sky, locked onto mine. "You see things other people miss. That's rare." Looking back now, I wonder if he saw me the same way I later saw my plants. Something to cultivate. Something useful. But that night, with the band playing soft jazz and his hand warm on my elbow as he guided me to the dance floor, I thought I'd found something real. 3 months later, we were married. My parents were thrilled. Harold came from money, or at least the appearance of it. My mother kept saying I'd married well, like I'd won some kind of prize. My father, quieter but just as pleased, gave us his blessing and a warning: money doesn't make a marriage, Ellie. Character does. I should have listened harder to that second part. The first year was beautiful. Harold worked constantly, building what he called his empire from scratch, Whitmore Holdings, a logistics company that was supposed to revolutionize supply chain management. I didn't understand half of what he talked about, but I loved watching his passion. I'd come home from teaching to find him at our kitchen table, surrounded by papers and coffee cups, planning routes and negotiating contracts. "We're going to be something, Eleanor," he'd say, pulling me onto his lap. "You and me, we're going to leave a mark on this world." I believed him. God help me, I believed every word. But then came 1970, and everything fell apart. Harold's biggest investor pulled out. A contract fell through. Suddenly, the company that was supposed to change everything was drowning in debt. I'd come home to find Harold staring at the wall, barely speaking. The light that had drawn me to him started flickering out. "I'm going to lose it all," he told me one night, his voice hollow. "Everything I've built. I'll be a laughingstock. Your parents will think you married a failure." That's when I made the choice that would define the rest of my life. My parents had left me their farm when they passed, 60 acres in rural Pennsylvania, land that had been in the Hayes family for 4 generations. It was supposed to be my safety net, my inheritance, my connection to where I came from. I sold every inch of it. Every tree, every field, every memory. I took that money, $47,000, which was a fortune in 1970, and I gave it to Harold. No questions asked. No conditions. Just love, or what I thought was love. Have you ever given up everything for someone, only to wonder later if they ever understood what it cost you? Drop a comment if you know that feeling. Harold cried when I handed him the check. Actually cried. I'll never forget this, Eleanor. Never. You saved me. You saved us. He held my face in his hands, kissed my forehead. I'm going to make this right. I promise you. And he did make it right, in his way. The money stabilized Whitmore Holdings. Within 2 years, the company was growing again. Within 5, it was thriving. Harold bought us the house, the estate that Graham and Vivian think they're inheriting right now, and I stopped teaching to manage our home. That's when I started the greenhouse. Just a hobby at first, something to fill the hours while Harold worked 16-hour days. I'd always loved plants, loved the patience they required, the way they responded to care. My first orchid, a simple white phalaenopsis, bloomed on our 5th anniversary, and I felt prouder of that flower than anything else I'd accomplished. Harold noticed. You've got a gift, Eleanor, he said, touching the delicate petals. Everything you touch grows. If only I'd known then that growth can happen in darkness, in silence, in places no one thinks to look. Our son Graham arrived in 1973. He was perfect, 10 fingers, 10 toes, Harold's blue eyes and my dark hair. I thought a child would complete us, bring Harold home more often, make us a real family instead of just a man chasing success and a woman tending plants. But children don't fix what's already broken. They just give you something else to worry about losing. Graham grew up watching his father build an empire. He saw the respect Harold commanded, the way people jumped when he called, the way money solved every problem. By the time Graham was 10, he was already talking like a businessman. By 15, he was working summers at Whitmore Holdings, learning the trade. And me? I became invisible. The woman in the greenhouse. The quiet wife who made sure dinner was ready and the house was clean. Harold would bring clients home, and they'd shake my hand politely before spending the evening talking about margins and market share while I served drinks and smiled. Your wife doesn't join the conversation much, one of them commented once. Harold laughed. Eleanor prefers her plants to people. Don't you, darling? I smiled and nodded, because what else could I do? But inside, something was starting to crack. Because I'd given him everything, my inheritance, my career, my identity, and somehow I'd become nothing more than background noise in my own life. Then came 1972, the year that changed everything, though no one knew it except Harold and me. The year we went to see Robert Harrington about protecting the business. The year Harold looked at me across that lawyer's desk and said, I want to put the core assets in Eleanor's name. Just as insurance, in case something happens to me. I remember Mr. Harrington raising his eyebrows. That's highly unusual, Harold. Your wife would essentially own. I know exactly what she'd own, Harold interrupted. She's the reason any of this exists. This is me keeping my promise. So we did it. Signed the papers. Made it legal. The logistics division, the supply chain network, the real estate portfolio, all registered under my name. Eleanor Whitmore, owner. Harold would still manage everything, still make all the decisions, but on paper, I owned the empire. This stays between us, Harold said as we left the lawyer's office. No one needs to know. It's just protection. You understand? I nodded. I understood. Or I thought I did. I thought it was love, trust, respect. I thought it meant I mattered. What I didn't understand was that secrets are like seeds. You plant them in darkness, and you never quite know what's going to grow. Years passed. Graham graduated college, got his MBA, joined Whitmore Holdings full-time. Harold started talking about legacy, succession, the future. And I kept tending my plants, watching them grow, learning their secrets. Learning that the strongest things often look the most fragile. Learning that roots can break through concrete if you give them enough time. Then Graham brought Vivian home, and I knew, the way you sometimes just know things, that nothing would ever be the same again. She walked into our house like she already owned it. Vivian Turner was the kind of beautiful that made other women check their makeup. Tall and blonde, with green eyes that could charm or cut depending on what she needed, she had Harold captivated from the moment Graham introduced her. "Dad, Mom, this is Vivian," Graham said at Sunday dinner, his chest puffed with pride. He was 28 then, newly promoted to Vice President of Operations, and Vivian was his trophy, proof that he'd made it. "Mr. Whitmore," Vivian purred, extending her hand to Harold first. "Not to me. Never to me. Graham has told me so much about your incredible success. Whitmore Holdings is practically legendary in business circles." Harold actually blushed. My husband of 30 years, blushing like a schoolboy. "Well, we've worked hard. Graham's been instrumental in our recent expansion." "Oh, I can tell." Vivian's laugh was like crystal, pretty but sharp. "He has such a brilliant mind for business. It must run in the family." Then, almost as an afterthought, she turned to me. Her smile didn't change, but something in her eyes did. "And Mrs. Whitmore, Graham mentioned you have a lovely garden." "Greenhouse," I corrected gently. "It's more of a greenhouse collection, actually. Rare orchids, mostly, and some medicinal." "How sweet." She cut me off mid-sentence. I've never had patience for plants. They seem so time-consuming for so little return. She laughed again, and Harold and Graham joined in, like she'd said something clever instead of insulting. That was my first taste of Vivian. Sweet poison, delivered with a smile. They married 6 months later in a ceremony that cost more than most people's houses. Vivian wanted everything perfect: the venue, the flowers, the guest list. She had opinions about every detail except one thing: she didn't want my input. "Eleanor," she said during one planning session, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "you've been so generous offering to help, but I really think this should be more contemporary. No offense, but your style is a bit dated." Harold, sitting right there, said nothing. Graham looked uncomfortable but stayed quiet. And I smiled and nodded and went back to my greenhouse, where at least the orchids didn't pretend to be anything other than what they were. After the wedding, things got worse. Vivian moved into our house, just temporarily, they said, while we look for our own place. Temporarily turned into 2 years. She redecorated the living room, the dining room, the guest wing. She held dinner parties where she played hostess and I was treated like hired help. "Eleanor dear," she'd call from the dining room, "could you bring more wine?" Not asking. Commanding. The worst part wasn't Vivian's cruelty, it was watching Graham become someone I didn't recognize. My son, who used to bring me dandelions from the yard, who'd help me water the roses, who'd fall asleep in my lap during thunderstorms. That boy was gone, replaced by this man who laughed when his wife mocked me. One night at dinner, Vivian was going on about some charity gala she was planning. "We'll need the A-list, obviously. The Hendersons, the Carmichaels, people who actually matter in this city." She took a sip of wine, then glanced at me. "Eleanor, you wouldn't be comfortable at something like that anyway. All that small talk about investments and market trends. I know you prefer your plants." Graham grinned. "Mom wouldn't know a stock portfolio from a flower pot." They laughed. Harold chuckled along. And something inside me, something that had been bending for years, finally snapped. Not on the outside. On the outside, I stayed perfectly calm, perfectly pleasant. But inside, I made a decision. I would remember every slight, every dismissal, every moment they made me feel like nothing. And I would wait. Because that's what you do in a greenhouse. You wait. You're patient. You understand that growth happens slowly, invisibly, until one day you look up and find that the tiny seedling has become something that can't be ignored. Harold's health started failing in his early 70s. Small things at first: forgetting names, misplacing his keys, getting winded climbing stairs. Then came the first stroke. Not a bad one, the doctors said, but a warning. He needed to slow down, reduce stress, let Graham handle more of the business. Graham was thrilled. "This is it, Dad. My time to show what I can do. Don't worry about a thing." But I worried. Because I saw how Graham ran things, aggressively, impatiently, cutting corners Harold never would have cut. I heard the late-night phone calls about deals gone wrong, partners pulling out. I watched the business that Harold had built with such care start to fray at the edges under Graham's reckless ambition. Maybe you should step back in, I suggested to Harold one evening as I helped him into bed. Just as an advisor. Graham might need. Graham's fine, Harold interrupted, but his voice was weak. He's the future. I need to let go sometime. But the business. The business will be fine, Eleanor. His eyes met mine, and for just a moment, I saw fear there. It has to be. It's his legacy. It's all I have to leave him. I almost told him then. Almost reminded him that the business wasn't his to leave, that legally it was mine, that we'd made arrangements 30 years ago that everyone had forgotten. But the words stuck in my throat. Because what would that accomplish? Harold was tired. Sick. Fading. And maybe, despite everything, I still loved him. Or at least loved who he used to be. The second stroke came 2 years later. This one was worse. Harold spent 3 weeks in the hospital, and when he came home, he was different. Slower. Confused sometimes. He needed help with everything, dressing, eating, walking. I took care of him. Every day, every night. I fed him, bathed him, read to him from his favorite books. On good days, I'd wheel him out to the greenhouse, and we'd sit among the orchids while I told him about each one, their origins, their care requirements, their blooming cycles. You always loved these more than people, he said once, his words slurred from the stroke. Plants don't lie, I replied. They don't pretend to be something they're not. He looked at me for a long moment, and I thought maybe he understood. Maybe he finally saw what his silence had cost me, what his son had become, what his daughter-in-law had done to our family. But he just patted my hand and said, "You're a good woman, Eleanor. Better than I deserved." It was the closest thing to an apology I ever got. Meanwhile, Graham and Vivian were circling like vultures. They visited every day, but not to help. They'd stand in Harold's room talking about when the time comes and transition plans like he wasn't even there. Like I wasn't even there. Once Dad passes, Graham said one evening, standing in the doorway of Harold's bedroom while I adjusted his pillows, "We'll need to discuss living arrangements, Mom." I looked up. Living arrangements? Vivian stepped forward, her smile sharp. Well, this house is enormous. Much too big for one person. We were thinking Graham and I could move in permanently, and you could have the cottage. You know, the one by the greenhouse. It would be perfect for you, small, manageable, close to your plants. The cottage. The building we'd originally meant for storage. 800 square feet, no proper heating, windows that leaked in winter. This is my home, I said quietly. Technically, Graham said, and his voice had that edge it got when he was about to say something cruel, it's the estate's home. And once Dad's gone, the estate will need proper management. Vivian and I are building a family. We need space. What about what I need? Graham laughed. Actually laughed. Mom, let's be realistic. What do you need? The greenhouse, your plants, maybe a little garden. That's it. You've never been involved in the business, never cared about the real assets. You've made your priorities clear. Vivian touched his arm, a gesture that looked affectionate but felt calculated. We're not trying to be cruel, Eleanor. We're just being practical. You'll be much happier in the cottage, surrounded by your flowers. Less to worry about. Less to worry about. Like I was a child being sent to a smaller room because I couldn't handle adult responsibilities. Harold stirred in his bed, his eyes flickering open. He looked at Graham, at Vivian, at me. His mouth worked like he wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. One tear tracked down his weathered cheek. And still, he said nothing. Did nothing. My husband, who'd once promised to make everything right, who'd cried when I gave him my inheritance, who'd sworn he'd never forget, he just lay there, silent, while our son planned to erase me from the life we'd built together. That night, after Graham and Vivian left, after I'd settled Harold for sleep, I went to my greenhouse. My sanctuary. I walked among the orchids, touching their leaves, checking their roots. And I thought about what Mr. Harrington had told me years ago, when we'd set up the arrangement. These documents give you complete legal ownership, Mrs. Whitmore. Harold can manage the business, but you control it. If anything ever happens, if you ever need to exercise that control, All you have to do is say the word. I'd never said the word. Never even considered it. Because I trusted Harold, trusted that he'd protect me, trusted that our son would remember where he came from. But trust, I was learning, was like those delicate orchids on my highest shelf. Beautiful, fragile, and so easy to destroy. Harold died 3 months later, on a Tuesday morning in October. I was with him, holding his hand, when his breathing simply stopped. No drama, no final words. Just silence, and then absence. Graham called the funeral home. Vivian called the caterers. And I went to the greenhouse and cried among the flowers until I had no tears left. The funeral was enormous, hundreds of people, most of whom I'd never met. They all wanted to tell me how sorry they were, how much Harold had meant to them, how he'd changed their lives. And I smiled and nodded and played the grieving widow while inside I felt nothing. Or maybe everything. It was hard to tell. After the service, Graham pulled me aside. His suit was perfectly tailored, his expression serious but not sad. The will reading is next week, Mom. Wednesday at 2. Dad's lawyer, Harrington, will handle everything. I know, Robert, I said. Right. Well. Graham shifted his weight, suddenly awkward. Just prepare yourself, okay? Dad set things up to be fair, but fair doesn't always mean equal. You'll be taken care of, obviously. But the business, the real assets, those need to go to someone who can manage them properly. Someone like you. Exactly. He smiled, relieved that I understood. You'll see. Dad did right by everyone. You'll have everything you need. Everything I need. Like I was a pet being promised food and shelter. I touched Graham's cheek, the way I used to when he was small. Your father was a complicated man. Are you sure you knew him as well as you think you did? Something flickered across his face, confusion, maybe, or the first whisper of doubt. But then Vivian called his name, and the moment passed. He kissed my forehead and walked away, and I was left standing alone in the funeral home, surrounded by flowers people had sent, flowers that would die in a week because no one knew how to care for them properly. That's when I knew. The will reading wasn't going to be what Graham expected. Harold had made his choices, kept his promises in the only way he knew how. And I was about to find out if 30 years of patience had been worth the wait. The days between Harold's funeral and the will reading moved like honey through a sieve, slow, thick, suffocating. Graham and Vivian practically moved into the main house, treating it like their inheritance had already been confirmed. I'd come downstairs for breakfast to find Vivian rearranging furniture or Graham on the phone in Harold's office, feet up on the desk that still smelled like my husband's cologne. Just getting a head start on the transition, Graham explained when I asked what he was doing. There's a lot to handle. Accounts to secure, partners to reassure. The business doesn't stop just because Dad died. But they had time for other things. I'd overhear them late at night, sitting in the study with glasses of Harold's expensive scotch, planning their future. We'll renovate the whole east wing, Vivian was saying one night. I'd come down for water and stopped outside the door, hidden in shadow. Knock out those walls, make it more open. Modern. God knows Eleanor's taste is stuck in 1975. Graham laughed. We'll have to ease her into the cottage gently. She's stubborn about change. She's stubborn about everything. Have you noticed how she looks at me? Like I'm the villain in her little soap opera. Vivian's voice dripped with contempt. Poor Eleanor, with her precious plants. She never understood the real world, never contributed anything meaningful. She was decorative for your father, nothing more. That's not entirely fair, Graham said, but his voice lacked conviction. She took care of him. She was a good wife. A good wife supports her husband's ambitions, Graham. She doesn't hide in a greenhouse pretending the world doesn't exist. Ice clinked in a glass. At least she'll be out of our way soon. The cottage is perfect for her, small, isolated. She can play with her flowers and stay out of adult business. I should have said something. Walked in, confronted them, defended myself. But I didn't. Because I'd learned something valuable over the years. People reveal their true selves when they think no one's watching. And I was collecting revelations like pressed flowers, preserving them for later. The morning of the will reading, I woke before dawn. Couldn't sleep. I went to the greenhouse while the world was still dark, turning on the soft grow lights, checking each plant. My rarest orchid, a ghost orchid I'd cultivated for 12 years, was finally budding. Delicate white petals just starting to unfurl, so fragile they seemed impossible. "We're survivors, aren't we?" I whispered to it, touching the edge of one petal with my fingertip. "Everyone thinks we're fragile. Everyone underestimates us. But we've got roots that go deeper than they can imagine." The orchid didn't answer, obviously. But in its silence, I found strength. I dressed carefully that morning. Nothing flashy, just a simple black dress, modest pearls, comfortable shoes. Vivian was wearing Chanel, her hair and makeup perfect, like she was attending a premiere instead of a will reading. She looked me up and down when I came into the kitchen. "Oh, Eleanor," she sighed, like I'd disappointed her. "You couldn't have tried a little harder? There will be important people there. Business associates. You represent the Whitmore family now." "I'm wearing what Harold would have wanted," I said quietly. She rolled her eyes but said nothing else. The drive to Mr. Harrington's office felt eternal. Graham drove, Vivian in the passenger seat, me in the back like a child being taken to the principal's office. They talked the whole way about their plans, selling off some properties, restructuring the logistics division, modernizing the company. "What do you think, Mom?" Graham asked at one point, catching my eye in the rearview mirror. "I think you should wait to see what your father actually left you before you start spending it," I replied. Vivian laughed. "Always so cautious. That's what held Harold back, you know. He had vision, but Eleanor always wanted him to play it safe. Imagine what he could have built without that anchor." An anchor. That's what I was to them. Not a partner. Not a foundation. An anchor, dragging Harold down, holding Graham back. Let them think it. Anchors can also keep ships from drifting into rocks. Mr. Harrington's office was downtown, in one of those old buildings with marble floors and wood paneling that smelled like furniture polish and old money. His secretary led us to the conference room where others were already waiting. Uncle Robert and his wife Margaret, a few of Harold's old business partners, some distant cousins who'd never visited but certainly showed up for the will reading. Everyone looked at me with this mixture of pity and curiosity. Poor Eleanor. The widow. The woman who'd be set aside for the real heirs. If they only knew. Mr. Harrington entered at exactly 2 o'clock, carrying his leather briefcase and wearing that same precise expression he'd had for 30 years. He greeted everyone formally, offered condolences, then took his seat at the head of the table. "Shall we begin?" His voice was steady, professional. He opened the will, adjusted his glasses, and started reading. The first few items were standard: personal effects to various family members, some charitable donations, specific pieces of furniture or artwork to old friends. Everyone listened politely, waiting for the real prizes. Then came my part. "To my beloved wife Eleanor, I leave the greenhouse and all its plants." The words hung in the air for exactly one heartbeat before Graham exploded with laughter. The sound was so sudden, so loud, that Uncle Robert actually jumped. "The plants." Graham gasped between laughs. "Did you hear that, Vivian? Mom gets the plants." Vivian was already cackling, that high-pitched sound that made my teeth ache. "Oh my God, that's perfect. That's absolutely perfect." Harold knew exactly what she cared about. Around the table, others started chuckling. Cousin Margaret whispered something to Uncle Robert. One of Harold's business partners covered his mouth, but his shoulders shook with suppressed laughter. And Graham, my son, my baby boy who I'd carried and nursed and raised, Graham was pointing at me like I was the punchline to a joke. "See, Mom? I told you. We get the house, the business, the investment portfolio, all the real assets. You get to keep playing in your greenhouse. Exactly what you've always wanted, right?" My face burned. Not with shame, but with rage so hot it threatened to consume me. I kept my hands folded in my lap, kept my expression neutral, even as every eye in that room looked at me with pity or amusement or both. "Such a small inheritance," Vivian stage whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "But I suppose it's appropriate. She never did contribute to the business side. At least she gets what she loves." "The plants," Graham repeated, still laughing. "Of all things, the plants." The laughter spread like fire through dry grass. Even people who didn't know me, who'd never seen my greenhouse, who had no idea what I'd sacrificed, they laughed. Because it was funny, wasn't it? The businessman leaves his empire to his son and his silly hobby wife gets flowers. Hilarious. I caught Mr. Harrington's eye. He wasn't laughing. His jaw was tight, his fingers pressed against the will document, and there was something in his expression, anticipation maybe, or the look a chess player gets right before checkmate. If I may, he said, but his voice was too soft under the lingering laughter. Graham was wiping tears from his eyes. Sorry. It's just, Mom, no offense, but it's funny. Dad really knew you. Gave you exactly what would make you happy. Probably worth about $5,000, all told, Vivian added. Though I suppose some of those orchids might be valuable. Eleanor, you should insure them. Your entire inheritance in one greenhouse fire. She giggled at her own joke. Have you ever had a moment where you saw someone's true self so clearly it took your breath away? Where everything they'd hidden behind smiles and politeness just evaporated, leaving nothing but ugliness? That's what I saw in that conference room. Not just cruelty, but genuine contempt. They didn't just dismiss me, they despised me. And they were about to learn a very expensive lesson about underestimation. Mr. Harrington cleared his throat, louder this time. The laughter started to die down. Graham settled back in his chair, grinning like he'd just won the lottery. Vivian was already pulling out her phone, probably texting friends about her inheritance. If I may continue, Mr. Harrington said, his voice cutting through the remaining chuckles. There appears to be some confusion about the estate that needs to be addressed. Graham waved a hand dismissively. No confusion here. It's pretty clear. Mom gets the greenhouse, we get everything else. Let's wrap this up, I've got a meeting with the board at 4. That's precisely the confusion I'm referring to. Mr. Harrington's tone sharpened. He removed another folder from his briefcase, this one noticeably thicker than the first. Mr. Whitmore's will distributes his personal assets, the house, vehicles, personal investments, etc. However, the primary business assets of Whitmore Holdings are not actually his to distribute. You could have heard a pin drop in that silence. Graham's smile froze. What are you talking about? Of course they're his. He built that company from nothing. Everyone here knows that. Indeed, Harold Whitmore built the company, Mr. Harrington agreed. He managed it, grew it, made every major decision for over 40 years. But legally, he paused, letting the word hang in the air like a sword. The core assets have been registered under a different name since 1972. The room held its breath. What name? Vivian demanded, her voice suddenly shrill. This is ridiculous. If there's some kind of corporate structure. Eleanor Whitmore. Mr. Harrington looked directly at me as he said it. The logistics division, the supply chain network, the commercial real estate holdings, the intellectual property rights, and controlling interest in 17 subsidiary companies are all legally registered in Eleanor Whitmore's name. They have been for over 50 years. Time seemed to stop. Or maybe it was just that my heart was beating so loud I couldn't hear anything else. Every face in that room turned toward me, shocked, confused, disbelieving. Graham's face had gone from flushed with laughter to pale as chalk. That's impossible. There must be a mistake. Dad wouldn't. There is no mistake, Mr. Harrington said firmly. He pulled out document after document, spreading them across the table. These are the registration papers, filed in 1972 and updated regularly since. Mrs. Whitmore is, and has been, the legal owner of Whitmore Holdings' primary assets. Your father managed them on her behalf, but ownership never transferred. She didn't even work there. Vivian shrieked. She knows nothing about business. This can't be legal. It's entirely legal. Mr. Harrington's voice could have frozen water. And Mrs. Whitmore's involvement in the business operations, or lack thereof, has no bearing on legal ownership. The documents are ironclad. I should know, I drafted them myself, at Harold's explicit request. Graham turned to me, his eyes wild. Mom? Did you know about this? Did you know the whole time? Everyone was looking at me, waiting for me to explain, to justify, to apologize for somehow deceiving them by owning what had always been mine. I met my son's eyes and remembered every dismissive comment, every mocking laugh, every time he'd made me feel small. I remembered Vivian's contempt, Harold's silence, all those years of being invisible in my own life.
And I smiled. Except they did know. Graham knew. Or at least, he should have. Because I'd mentioned it.
Not loudly, not dramatically, but I'd said the words at least a dozen times over the years when he was younger.
Your father and I are partners in the business, Graham. Everything your father built, we built together. The company wouldn't exist without both of us. But he never heard me. None of them did.
Because I was just Mom, just the plant lady, and nothing I said about business could possibly matter. Now, watching my son's face crumble as reality crashed down on him, I felt something I didn't expect.
Not satisfaction. Not vindication. Just sadness.
Deep, aching sadness for the relationship we'd lost, for the man he'd become, for the mother he'd stopped seeing years ago.
Mom.
His voice was small now, nothing like the booming laughter from 10 minutes earlier.
Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you remind Dad?
If you owned everything, why let him run it like it was his?
Because it was his, I said simply. In every way that mattered.
He built it, grew it, made every important decision.
I just held the papers.
That's what he needed, someone to hold the foundation while he built the walls.
Then why? Graham's hands were shaking. Why are you doing this now? Why humiliate me in front of everyone? I'm not humiliating you, Graham. I'm telling you the truth.
I looked around the conference room at all the shocked faces. Your father left you everything he could leave, his personal assets, his reputation, his connections. But the business was never his to give.
It was already mine.
Vivian grabbed Graham's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his suit jacket.
Don't just sit there. Do something. She's stealing your inheritance.
She can't steal what was never mine, Graham said, and for the first time in years, I heard my real son in those words. The boy who used to understand fairness, who used to see truth even when it hurt. But then Vivian's poison worked its way back in. She leaned close, whispering furiously in his ear, and I saw his expression harden again. The moment of clarity vanished like morning mist.
Fine, he said, standing abruptly. You want the business? Keep it.
See how long you last running something you know nothing about. Dad managed it for 40 years because he understood commerce, strategy, market forces.
What do you understand, Mom? Fertilizer schedules. Graham, Uncle Robert tried to intervene. No. Graham cut him off. Let her have it.
Let her try to manage logistics operations and supply contracts and labor negotiations. Give her 6 months, hell, give her 6 weeks, and she'll be begging me to take over. Because knowing you own something and knowing how to run something are very different things.
He had a point. And he knew it.
And everyone in that room knew it. I could see it on their faces, the doubt, the curiosity about what would happen next. Eleanor Whitmore, who'd spent 50 years growing orchids, suddenly in charge of a multi-million-dollar company?
It would be a disaster. Wouldn't it?
Actually, Mr. Harrington said, and there was something almost amused in his tone, Mrs. Whitmore has been reviewing operational reports for the past 2 years. At her request, I've been providing quarterly summaries of all major business decisions, financial statements, and strategic plans.
She's quite well informed about the company's current status. Graham's face went slack. What?
After Harold's first stroke, I explained, keeping my voice gentle, I asked Robert to keep me updated. I needed to know what was happening with the business, especially as you took on more responsibility, Graham.
I needed to understand what Harold had built. What we had built. You've been spying on me?
The betrayal in Graham's voice cut deeper than any of Vivian's cruelty.
I've been paying attention, I corrected. There's a difference. And what I saw. I paused, choosing my words carefully.
What I saw was a young man making risky decisions, cutting corners his father never would have cut, prioritizing short-term gains over long-term stability.
The Hendricks contract, for instance. The one you pushed through last year. Graham went pale. How do you know about that?
I know that you undercut 3 safety protocols to meet their deadline. I know that you renegotiated terms that left our drivers working illegal hours. And I know that when Harold found out, he was going to reverse the deal, but he had his second stroke before he could.
I met my son's eyes.
I also know that contract is about to blow up in very spectacular fashion when the DOT audit comes through next month." The silence in the room was deafening. Graham looked like I'd slapped him. "Those protocol changes were necessary," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "The industry is evolving. Dad's methods were too cautious. Too slow." "Your father's methods kept people safe," I said. "They kept our reputation intact. They built something that would last. What you've been building, Graham, is a house of cards." Vivian jumped in, her voice shrill with desperation. "You don't understand business, Eleanor. You can't just waltz in after 50 years and pretend you know better than Graham. He's been trained for this his entire life." "Trained by a man who forgot to teach him the most important lesson," I said quietly. "That integrity matters more than profit. That people matter more than contracts. That slow and steady beats reckless and fast every single time." I stood up, smoothing my simple black dress. Every eye followed me. "Graham, you're right about one thing. I don't know how to run every aspect of Whitmore Holdings. But I know how to recognize good growth from destructive growth. I know when something needs pruning to survive. And I know when roots are rotten, the whole plant suffers." "Are you firing me?" He sounded like a little boy again, scared and small. "No." I picked up my purse. "I'm offering you a choice. You can work with me, really work with me, not just pretend while you wait for me to fail, and we can fix the damage that's been done. We can rebuild the company the way your father would have wanted. Or you can walk away, and I'll find someone else to help me manage things." Graham's jaw clenched. "This is insane. You can't." "She can," Mr. Harrington interrupted. "Legally, Mrs. Whitmore has complete authority over all business operations. She can hire, fire, restructure, or dissolve the company entirely. It's her decision." "My decision," I repeated softly. "For the first time in 50 years, I get to make decisions about something I've owned all along." The power in those words was intoxicating. And terrifying. Because Graham was right about one thing: owning and managing were different things. I might have been reviewing reports for 2 years, but that didn't mean I knew how to navigate the actual day-to-day chaos of running a logistics empire. But I'd learned something from my plants. Sometimes you have to take a risk, put a cutting in new soil, hope the roots take hold. Sometimes you have to trust that what looks fragile is actually stronger than anyone imagined. "I need to think," Graham said finally. He looked at Vivian, who was practically vibrating with rage, then back at me. "I need time to process this." "Take all the time you need." I headed for the door. "Mr. Harrington has my number when you're ready to talk." "Eleanor," Uncle Robert called after me. "What about the house? The living arrangements?" I paused in the doorway, looking back at the room full of people who'd laughed at my inheritance of plants. "The house belongs to the estate, which means it belongs to me. I think I'll keep it. Graham and Vivian are welcome to find their own accommodations." Vivian's gasp of outrage followed me all the way to the elevator. I didn't go home. I couldn't face that house yet, couldn't deal with Graham's anger or Vivian's inevitable hysterics. Instead, I drove to the one place that had always been honest with me, always been real. The greenhouse. It was late afternoon, and the light coming through the glass panels was golden and warm. I moved through my plants slowly, checking leaves, adjusting positions, talking to them the way I always did when no one else was around. "Well," I said to my ghost orchid, the one that had finally decided to bloom, "I suppose we caused quite a scene today." The orchid didn't judge, didn't question, just existed in its quiet, persistent beauty. I touched the delicate white petals, so fragile they seemed impossible. But orchids were survivors. They adapted, persisted, found ways to thrive in the harshest conditions. They looked delicate, but their roots gripped tight, refusing to let go. Maybe I was more like my plants than even I had realized. My phone buzzed. A text from Mr. Harrington. "Well done. Call me tomorrow to discuss next steps." Then another text, this one from a number I didn't recognize. "This isn't over, Eleanor. You'll regret this." I didn't need to guess who'd sent it. Vivian's threats were as empty as her soul. But still, reading those words in the peaceful sanctuary of my greenhouse sent a chill down my spine. Because it wasn't over. The revelation at the will reading was just the beginning. Now came the hard part, actually doing something with the power I'd suddenly claimed. Making decisions, managing people, proving that I was more than just the plant lady everyone had dismissed for 50 years.
Could I do it? Did I even want to?
I looked around my greenhouse, at all the beauty I'd cultivated through patience and attention and love. Each plant represented years of care, learning, adaptation. I'd built this sanctuary from nothing, transformed a simple hobby into something extraordinary. Maybe business wasn't so different. Maybe the same principles applied: patience, attention, recognizing what needed nurturing and what needed cutting away.
Or maybe I was fooling myself.
Maybe Graham was right, and I'd crash and burn within weeks.
Only one way to find out.
I took a deep breath, smelling jasmine and orchids and rich soil. Whatever happened next, I wasn't going to hide anymore. Wasn't going to be invisible. For better or worse, Eleanor Whitmore was stepping out of the greenhouse and into the light. And God help anyone who underestimated me again. The house was dark when I finally returned, just after 8 o'clock. I expected chaos: Graham's car in the driveway, Vivian's voice echoing through the halls, demands and accusations and threats. But there was only silence, heavy and thick as fog. The envelope was on the kitchen counter. Plain white, my name written in Graham's sharp handwriting. I stared at it for a long moment before opening it, somehow knowing that whatever was inside would change things forever.
Mom, we're staying at the Hilton tonight. Need space to think.
We'll come by tomorrow to get our things.
Don't try to contact us. G. Short. Cold.
The way you'd write to a business associate you'd never liked, not to your mother. I read it 3 times, looking for something: anger, hurt, anything that suggested emotion beneath the words.
But there was nothing.
Just empty formality, like I'd become a stranger to my own son.
Maybe I always had been.
I made tea and sat in the greenhouse until midnight, wrapped in Harold's old cardigan, watching the moon track across the glass ceiling. The plants rustled in the ventilation breeze, and somewhere in that sound, I found a kind of peace.
This was who I was.
This was what I'd chosen, all those years ago when I decided to be underestimated rather than confrontational. And now I was living with the consequences, powerful, yes, but also alone.
The next morning, I called Mr. Harrington.
"Eleanor,"
he answered on the first ring. "I was expecting to hear from you. How are you holding up?"
"Honestly,
I'm not sure."
I looked out my bedroom window at the sprawling estate grounds.
"Robert, what have I done?"
"You've claimed what's rightfully yours," he said firmly. "And you've put your son on notice that actions have consequences.
That's not cruelty, Eleanor. That's justice."
"It doesn't feel like justice. It feels like I've destroyed my family."
"Your family was already fractured."
His voice gentled.
"You didn't break it, Eleanor.
You just stopped pretending it wasn't broken." The truth in those words hit me like cold water.
He was right.
The fractures had been there for years. Every dismissive comment, every mocking laugh, every time Graham chose Vivian's cruelty over his mother's dignity.
I'd just been too afraid to acknowledge the damage.
"What do I do now?"
I asked.
"Now you decide what kind of owner you want to be."
Papers rustled on his end.
"I've prepared several options. You could maintain the status quo, keep Graham on as operational manager with you as silent majority owner. You could bring in outside management to run things while you learn the business. Or you could sell everything, take the money, and let someone else deal with the headaches."
"Sell."
The word felt wrong in my mouth.
"It's an option.
A very lucrative option. Whitmore Holdings would fetch somewhere between 40 and 50 million in the current market. You'd be set for life, and Graham would get nothing, which some might argue is exactly what he deserves after how he's treated you.
$50 million.
More money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes. Enough to vanish, start over somewhere new, never have to see the disappointment in my son's eyes again. But also enough to prove them right. To confirm that I'd never cared about the business, that I was just the plant lady who got lucky with paperwork. That Harold's empire meant nothing to me beyond its dollar value.
"I'm not selling," I heard myself say.
"Are you sure?"
"Eleanor, running this company will be."
"I'm sure."
And surprisingly, I was.
Harold built something good. Something that mattered. I'm not going to destroy it just because my son doesn't appreciate where it came from.
Mr. Harrington was quiet for a moment. Then, all right. Then we need to discuss immediate steps. First, you need to officially take over operational control. That means meetings with department heads, notifications to partners and clients, and a formal announcement of the ownership transfer. My stomach dropped. Meetings? Announcements? Robert, I don't. You don't have to do it alone, he interrupted. I'll be there. And I'd recommend bringing in a business consultant, someone who can help you navigate the first few months while you get your feet under you. We spent the next hour going through logistics. It was overwhelming, names and titles and departments I barely understood, contracts I needed to review, decisions that couldn't wait. By the time we hung up, my head was spinning and my hands were shaking. What had I been thinking? I couldn't run a company. I could barely run a household. All those years of reviewing quarterly reports didn't mean anything compared to actual day-to-day management. Graham had been right. I'd crash and burn, and everyone would laugh even harder than they had at the will reading. The doorbell rang at 2 o'clock. I answered it to find Graham and Vivian standing on the porch, 3 suitcases between them. We're here for our things, Vivian announced, brushing past me without waiting for an invitation. The rest of our belongings will be picked up by movers tomorrow. Graham wouldn't meet my eyes. He looked exhausted, shadows under his eyes like he hadn't slept. Part of me wanted to reach for him, to apologize, to make things right the way mothers are supposed to. But I stayed still, watching him follow his wife up the stairs to their room. They were there for 45 minutes. I heard drawers slamming, closet doors banging, Vivian's voice raised in anger though I couldn't make out the words. When they finally came back down, loaded with bags and boxes, Graham paused in the doorway. I talked to the department heads this morning, he said, still not looking at me. Told them you'd be taking over. They're concerned. I imagine they are. Mom, finally, he looked up. This is a mistake. I know you're angry, and maybe you have a right to be, but you can't run Whitmore Holdings on principles and good intentions. There are real problems, real challenges that require experience you don't have. Then help me, I said simply. Work with me. Teach me what I don't know. Be my son instead of my adversary. Something flickered across his face, longing, maybe, or regret. For one heartbeat, I thought he might say yes. Might choose me over Vivian, over his pride, over everything that had brought us to this breaking point. Then Vivian called from the car, impatient and sharp, and the moment shattered. I can't, Graham said quietly. Not like this. Not with you holding all the power and me reduced to, what? Your employee? Your charity case? You'd rather walk away with nothing? I'd rather walk away with my dignity. He picked up the last box. When you're ready to sell, and you will be, probably within a month, call me first. I'll find buyers, handle the negotiations. That's the least I can do for Dad's memory. He was halfway to the car before I found my voice. Graham? Your father loved you. He wanted you to have everything. But he loved me too, and he knew what I'd sacrificed. He tried to honor both of us. I wish you could understand that. Graham stopped but didn't turn around. What I understand is that you've chosen the business over your son. That's your right. But don't expect me to pretend it doesn't hurt. Then he was gone, pulling out of the driveway in a spray of gravel, leaving me standing in the doorway of a house that suddenly felt enormous and empty. I should have felt victorious, powerful, justified. Instead, I felt hollow. That night, back in the greenhouse, I found myself talking to the plants like they could answer. Did I do the right thing? I asked the ghost orchid. Or did I just destroy the only family I have left? The orchid swayed slightly in the ventilation breeze, its white petals luminous in the grow lights. It had taken 12 years to bloom, 12 years of patience and careful attention, and refusing to give up even when it seemed hopeless. Maybe that was my answer. Maybe some things took time, required patience, demanded that you keep going even when you couldn't see the results yet. Or maybe I was just a foolish old woman who'd mistaken stubbornness for strength. My phone buzzed. Another text from an unknown number. Enjoy your victory while it lasts. Some of us remember what you really are, a gold digger who got lucky with paperwork. Harold must be rolling in his grave. I deleted it without responding. But the words stuck, poisonous as Vivian's smile. Was that what people thought?
That I'd manipulated Harold, stolen what should have been his, used legal tricks to cheat my own son?
The doubt crept in like frost, and I couldn't shake it. By morning, I had my answer. Not from soul-searching or prayer or any dramatic revelation, but from a phone call at 6 a.m., Mr. Harrington's voice urgent and tight.
"Eleanor, we have a problem.
A big one."
The Hendricks contract I mentioned, the one Graham pushed through?
The DOT audit came back early.
They're threatening to revoke our operating licenses in 3 states unless we can prove immediate compliance with safety regulations.
This could shut down 40% of our operations. I was awake instantly, my heart racing. How bad?
Bad enough that if we don't fix it in the next 72 hours, Whitmore Holdings might not survive the month.
He paused.
"Eleanor, I know this is terrible timing, but you need to make a decision. Bring Graham back to handle it, he knows the situation, or step up and handle it yourself."
"But it has to be now." There it was. The moment of truth.
Call my son, admit I needed him, prove everyone right about my inability to manage the business.
Or step into the fire and hope I didn't burn alive. I looked at my ghost orchid, still blooming after 12 years of patience. "I'll handle it," I said.
And somewhere deep inside, beneath the fear and doubt and terror, I felt something else stirring.
Something that felt almost like courage.
The Whitmore Holdings headquarters building looked different at 7 in the morning.
Bigger. More intimidating.
Like a fortress I was supposed to storm armed with nothing but good intentions and a lifetime of growing flowers. Mr. Harrington met me in the lobby, briefcase in hand and another man beside him, younger maybe 40, with sharp eyes and the kind of efficient energy that suggested he'd already had 3 cups of coffee.
"Eleanor, this is Marcus Chun. He's the consultant I mentioned. Specializes in crisis management and operational turnarounds." I took the liberty of bringing him in when I heard about the DOT situation. Marcus extended his hand. "Mrs. Whitmore, I've reviewed the preliminary reports. We've got our work cut out for us."
"That's putting it mildly," I said, shaking his hand.
His grip was firm, businesslike. "I appreciate you coming on such short notice. Honestly,
this is the most interesting case I've had in months." He grinned, and I realized he was actually excited about the crisis. A logistics company facing federal sanctions while undergoing ownership transfer to someone with 0 operational experience?
It's like a business school case study come to life.
"Glad I can provide entertainment," I said dryly.
His grin widened. "Oh, I like you.
Come on, department heads are waiting in the conference room."
Fair warning, they're not happy.
That turned out to be an understatement. The conference room was on the top floor, with windows overlooking the city and a table large enough to seat 20 people. 10 of those seats were filled, the department heads Mr. Harrington had mentioned, plus a few others whose titles I didn't quite catch. They all looked up when I entered, and the skepticism on their faces was so thick you could cut it with a knife.
"Good morning," I said, taking the seat at the head of the table.
My heart was hammering so hard I thought they might hear it.
"Thank you for coming on such short notice. Mrs. Whitmore." A heavy-set man with gray hair spoke first. "I'm Thomas Berkeley, VP of Operations.
I think I speak for everyone here when I say we're confused about the current situation. Graham informed us yesterday that you're taking over management, but he didn't provide details about the transition plan or timeline."
"That's because there isn't one," I said honestly.
"The transition is happening now, immediately, because we have a crisis that can't wait for gradual changes." A woman across the table, late 50s, sharp suit, sharper expression, leaned forward.
"Janet Reeves, Chief Financial Officer."
"With all due respect, Mrs. Whitmore, handling a DOT compliance crisis requires specific expertise and relationships with federal regulators."
"What's your background in logistics management?"
"None whatsoever," I admitted, and watched the shock ripple around the table. "I've never managed operations, never negotiated with federal agencies, never handled anything remotely like what we're facing.
But I do know 3 things that matter right now." I counted them off on my fingers.
1. I own this company, which means its survival is my responsibility. 2. Graham created this problem through reckless decisions that prioritized profit over safety. And 3. Every person at this table has more operational experience than I do, which is exactly why I need your help."
The honesty seemed to catch them off guard. Thomas Berkeley exchanged glances with Janet Reeves. Others shifted in their seats, uncertain how to respond. "You're asking us to trust you," Thomas said slowly, "when you just admitted you don't know what you're doing?" "No. I'm asking you to help me learn while we fix the problem together." I looked around the table, meeting each person's eyes. Harold built this company by surrounding himself with smart people and listening to them. That's what I plan to do. Marcus Chin is here to provide crisis management expertise. Mr. Harrington will handle legal aspects. And each of you knows your department better than anyone else. I'm not here to pretend I have all the answers. I'm here to make sure we find them. A younger man at the end of the table spoke up. David Park, Head of Safety and Compliance.
The DOT audit identified 17 violations of federal hours of service regulations, 12 instances of inadequate vehicle maintenance documentation, and 5 cases of drivers operating without proper rest breaks. Graham knew about most of these issues and chose to ignore them to meet the Hendricks contract deadlines.
"Can we fix them?" I asked. "In 72 hours? David looked skeptical. "It's going to be tight.
We'd need to pull drivers off routes for mandatory rest, which means delayed deliveries. We'd need to halt operations on 12 vehicles for immediate maintenance. And we'd need to produce documentation for federal inspectors that honestly shows how we're correcting the problems."
"Then that's what we do."
I kept my voice steady even though my hands were shaking under the table.
"Whatever it takes to get into compliance.
I don't care about the short-term costs or the Hendricks contract. I care about keeping this company operating legally and keeping our people safe." "The Hendricks contract is worth $2.3 million annually," Janet Reeves pointed out. "If we breach terms by failing to meet deadlines, they'll sue for damages and likely take their business elsewhere.
That's a significant revenue loss."
"How much will we lose if the DOT revokes our operating licenses in 3 states?"
I countered.
Janet's lips pressed into a thin line. "Approximately $18 million annually, plus the cost of rebuilding reputation and regaining licenses."
"Then the choice is clear." I looked at David.
"What do you need from me to get us into compliance?" What followed was 3 hours of the most intense education I'd ever received. David walked me through every violation, explaining regulations I'd never heard of, describing the cascade of problems Graham's shortcuts had created. Janet showed me the financial implications, the cash flow issues, the delicate balance between compliance costs and operational revenue. Thomas detailed the logistics of pulling drivers and vehicles offline without completely destroying our service commitments. And through it all, Marcus Chun took notes, asked sharp questions, and occasionally leaned over to quietly explain something I didn't understand.
By noon, I was exhausted.
My brain felt like it had been run through a blender.
But we had a plan. 72 hours, David summarized.
We pull 14 drivers for mandatory 24-hour rest periods, rotating them so we don't completely halt operations.
We red tag 12 vehicles for immediate maintenance.
We produce complete documentation showing our correction plan and submit it to the DOT by Friday morning. If they accept our remediation plan, we avoid license revocation.
And if they don't? I asked.
The silence that followed answered my question.
All right.
I stood up, trying to project confidence I didn't feel.
Let's get to work.
David, your point person on DOT communication. Janet, figure out the financial impact and what we need to do to stay liquid through this. Thomas, manage the operational disruption and keep our clients informed.
Everyone else, support where needed.
They filed out, some looking doubtful, others seeming cautiously hopeful.
Mr. Harrington lingered behind with Marcus. Well? I asked when the room was empty.
How bad did I mess that up?
You didn't, Marcus said, surprising me.
You did exactly what they needed, acknowledged your limitations, asked for help, and made clear decisions based on the information provided.
That's actually pretty solid leadership. I felt like I was drowning.
Everyone feels that way during their first crisis management meeting.
He grinned.
The difference is whether you drown or learn to swim.
You're swimming.
Mr. Harrington nodded agreement. Eleanor, I've sat through hundreds of business meetings in this building. What you just did, the honesty, the willingness to listen, the focus on doing the right thing instead of the profitable thing. That's what Harold used to do.
Before he got tired. Before he let Graham push him into cutting corners. The comparison to Harold hit me harder than I expected. I'm not Harold. No, Mr. Harrington agreed. You're better. Because you haven't forgotten what matters. I wanted to believe him.
But as I looked out the conference room windows at the city below, all I could think about was 72 hours.
3 days to prove I could do this. 3 days before everything either stabilized or collapsed completely. My phone buzzed. A text from Graham, heard about the DOT crisis. You're going to need help. Call me when you're ready to admit it. I stared at those words for a long moment. It would be so easy.
Call him back, let him fix the mess he'd created, step aside and pretend the will reading had never happened. Everyone would be relieved, the department heads, the employees, probably even Harold's ghost. Instead, I texted back, I've got it handled. But thank you for the offer. His response came immediately, stubborn as always. Don't say I didn't warn you when it all falls apart. Marcus was watching me. Family. My son. He's not supportive of this transition. Because he thinks you'll fail, or because he's afraid you'll succeed? The question stopped me cold. I'd assumed Graham wanted me to fail, wanted to be proven right about my incompetence. But what if Marcus was right? What if Graham's real fear was that I'd succeed, that I'd prove I didn't need him, that his father had been right to trust me with the foundation of the empire? I don't know, I admitted. Well, you've got 72 hours to figure it out. Marcus packed up his laptop. Get some rest tonight, Mrs. Whitmore. Tomorrow's going to be even harder. He wasn't wrong. The next 2 days blurred into an endless cycle of meetings, phone calls, documentation reviews, and crisis management. I learned more about federal transportation regulations than I'd ever wanted to know. I listened to angry clients demanding explanations for delayed shipments. I signed off on maintenance expenditures that made my head spin. And I watched the clock tick down toward Friday morning's DOT deadline with increasing anxiety. Through it all, the department heads watched me. Testing. Evaluating. Waiting to see if I'd crack under pressure or admit defeat and call Graham back. I didn't crack. But God, I wanted to. Thursday night, alone in my office, Harold's office, though I still couldn't think of it as mine, I found myself staring at a photo on the desk. Harold and Graham at some business conference, both in suits, both smiling. Father and son, legacy and heir. Except the heir had almost destroyed what the father built. And the wife everyone dismissed had to step in and clean up the mess. If Harold could see me now, what would he think? Pride? Regret? Disappointment that I'd let things get this bad before taking action? I hope I'm making you proud, I whispered to the photo. I hope this is what you wanted when you put everything in my name. Because it's terrifying, Harold. And I'm not sure I can do it. The photo didn't answer. But somewhere in the silence of that office, I found something. Not confidence exactly, but determination. The same quality that had kept me caring for orchids for 12 years, waiting for blooms that seemed impossible. Patience. Persistence. The refusal to give up just because something was hard. My phone rang at 6 a.m. Friday morning. David Park, his voice tense. The DOT inspectors are here. They want to review everything we've submitted and do a physical inspection of our facilities. Can you come down? I'll be there in 20 minutes. This was it. The moment where everything either came together or fell apart. Where I either proved I could lead this company or proved every skeptic right. I drove to the headquarters in the pre-dawn darkness, Harold's cardigan over my shoulders like armor, and prepared to face the most important test of my life. The DOT inspectors looked exactly like I'd imagined, stern, clipboard-wielding, the kind of people who took regulations seriously and had zero patience for excuses. There were 3 of them, led by a woman named Inspector Patricia Morrison who had the energy of someone who'd seen every trick in the book and wasn't impressed by any of them. Mrs. Whitmore. She shook my hand with a grip that could crush walnuts. I understand you've recently assumed control of operations here. 2 days ago, I admitted. Right when we discovered the compliance issues. Her eyebrow raised. Convenient timing. Not really, I said honestly. But I'm not here to make excuses.
I'm here to show you what we've done to fix the problems and ensure they never happen again. David Park stood beside me, folders of documentation stacked in his arms like a paper fortress. Behind him, Marcus Chen and Mr. Harrington watched from a distance, ready to intervene if needed but letting me take the lead. Patricia Morrison scanned the compliance plan we'd submitted. You voluntarily pulled 14 drivers offline for rest violations. That's going to cost you in operational capacity. Better than costing us in driver safety or license revocations, I replied. Something flickered in her expression, not quite approval, but maybe recognition that I understood what actually mattered. She looked at her colleagues. Let's start with vehicle maintenance records. Show me the 12 units you've red tagged. The next 4 hours were brutal. The inspectors went through every document, every maintenance log, every driver schedule with meticulous attention. They physically inspected the vehicles we'd pulled offline, checking for the violations cited in the original audit. They interviewed drivers, asking about working conditions and whether they'd been pressured to exceed hours of service limits. And through it all I stood there, answering questions when I could, deferring to David when I couldn't, trying to project calm competence while my stomach twisted into knots. At one point, Inspector Morrison pulled me aside. Mrs. Whitmore, I need you to understand something. We're not here to destroy your business. We're here to ensure public safety. The violations we found weren't minor paperwork issues, they were systemic problems that put drivers and the public at risk. I understand, I said. And I take full responsibility. These problems developed under my company's management, which means they're my problems to fix. Were you aware of the violations before the audit? Here was the moment of truth. I could lie, claim ignorance, throw Graham under the bus. Or I could tell the truth and accept the consequences. I became aware of concerning operational decisions about 6 months ago, I said carefully. Safety protocol shortcuts, pressure to meet unrealistic deadlines. I was reviewing quarterly reports but wasn't in active management at the time. My husband was ill, and our son was running operations. I should have intervened sooner. That failure is on me. Patricia Morrison studied my face for a long moment. Most owners in your position would blame the previous manager and distance themselves from the problems. The previous manager is my son, I said quietly. And blaming him doesn't fix anything. The company is mine. The responsibility is mine. All I can do now is make it right. She nodded slowly, made a note on her clipboard, and returned to the inspection. By 2 o'clock, they'd seen everything. The 3 inspectors huddled in the parking lot, reviewing notes, discussing findings in voices too low for me to hear. David stood beside me, fidgeting nervously. Marcus and Mr. Harrington had joined us, forming a kind of support line. Whatever happens, Marcus said quietly, you handled this with integrity. That matters. Will integrity keep us from losing our licenses? I asked. Sometimes, he said. Sometimes not. But it's still what matters. Inspector Morrison approached, her expression unreadable. My heart hammered against my ribs. Mrs. Whitmore, based on our inspection and review of your remediation plan, we're prepared to make a recommendation to the DOT regional office. She paused, and the silence stretched like taffy. The violations were serious and widespread. However, your response has been comprehensive and immediate. You've voluntarily taken corrective action that exceeds our minimum requirements. You've demonstrated genuine commitment to compliance rather than just paying lip service to regulations. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Therefore, she continued, we're recommending a conditional reinstatement of full operating authority. You'll be subject to follow-up inspections in 30, 60, and 90 days. Any new violations during that period will result in immediate license suspension. But as of now, you can resume normal operations. The relief hit me so hard I actually swayed. David grabbed my arm to steady me. Thank you, I managed. Thank you so much. Don't thank me yet, Patricia Morrison said, but there was something almost warm in her expression now. You've got 90 days to prove this wasn't a one-time performance. Make sure your entire organization understands that cutting corners isn't acceptable. Not for profit, not for client satisfaction, not for any reason. I understand. And I promise, this company will operate with integrity or not at all. She shook my hand again, gentler this time. I believe you mean that.
Make sure you still mean it 6 months from now when the pressure's on and clients are demanding faster service. Then they were gone, and I was standing in the parking lot surrounded by my team, shaking so hard I could barely stand.
We did it, David said, his voice filled with wonder. Holy shit, Mrs. Whitmore, we actually did it. You did it, I corrected. All of you. I just tried not to get in the way. Marcus laughed.
That's better leadership than most CEOs manage.
Come on, your department heads are waiting for the news. Let's go tell them they still have jobs.
The celebration in the conference room was subdued but genuine. Thomas Berkeley actually smiled at me, a real smile, not the skeptical grimace from 3 days ago.
Janet Reeves looked relieved.
David Park kept shaking his head like he couldn't believe we'd pulled it off. This doesn't solve all our problems, Janet reminded everyone. We've got the Hendricks contract breach to deal with, the operational losses from the downtime, and we're still running lean on cash reserves.
But at least we're still in business. What about Hendricks? I asked. Have they threatened legal action yet?
Their lawyers sent a preliminary notice yesterday, Mr. Harrington said, claiming breach of contract due to delayed deliveries. They're demanding either immediate compliance or compensation for damages.
Can we salvage the relationship? Thomas Berkeley shook his head. Honestly, I wouldn't want to.
The Hendricks contract was always problematic. Tight margins, unrealistic timelines, constant pressure to cut corners. It's the kind of client that destroys companies by forcing them to compromise their standards.
Then let it go, I said, and watched surprise ripple around the table.
If we can't service them properly without violating regulations, they're not the right client for us.
Find me clients who value quality and safety over speed and cheap prices.
That's a significant revenue loss, Janet warned.
I know.
But what's the alternative?
Keep chasing clients who force us to operate illegally?
Keep risking our licenses and our drivers' safety for profit?
I shook my head. No.
We're better than that. This company was built on integrity. We're going back to those foundations, even if it means smaller margins for a while.
The room was silent.
Then Thomas Berkeley started clapping, slow at first, then joined by others until the whole room erupted in applause.
I felt my face flush. I didn't do anything.
You made a hard decision based on principles instead of profit, Thomas said. That's exactly what this company needed. What we've all been waiting for someone to do. After the meeting, Marcus walked me to my car.
You surprised them today.
Hell, you surprised me. That decision to walk away from Hendricks? Most new owners would have done anything to preserve revenue. My husband used to say that the clients you turn away define you as much as the ones you accept, I said.
I'm just trying to remember his lessons.
Well, keep remembering them. You've got a long road ahead, financial restructuring, rebuilding client relationships, establishing yourself with the workforce. But today proved something important.
What's that?
He grinned. That you're not just the plant lady everyone dismissed. You're a leader who knows what matters. That's going to shake things up. I drove home in the late afternoon sun, exhausted but something close to hopeful. We'd survived the crisis. The company was still intact. I'd made decisions that felt right, even when they were hard. But the victory felt hollow without anyone to share it with.
Harold was gone.
Graham had made his choice. The house would be empty except for me and my plants. The moment I pulled into the driveway, I knew something was wrong. Graham's car was parked by the front door, and through the window I could see movement inside.
My heart sank. Another confrontation. More accusations.
More of Vivian's poison. But when I opened the door, I found only Graham. No Vivian, no luggage, just my son standing in the hallway looking lost and small despite his expensive suit.
Mom, he said, and his voice cracked.
I heard about the DOT inspection. Heard you got conditional approval.
We did.
The company's safe.
Yeah.
He looked at his shoes. I also heard you're walking away from the Hendricks contract. That's what Dad would have done. Before he got tired. Before I convinced him to chase growth at any cost. I waited, not sure what to say. I ruined it, Graham continued, his voice rough. I ruined everything Dad built because I wanted to prove I was better than him.
Smarter. More aggressive. And instead I almost destroyed the company, alienated you and… He looked up, and I saw tears in his eyes. And I became someone I don't even recognize. Graham. No, let me finish. He took a shaky breath. Vivian left me.
Said if you weren't going to sell the company, she wasn't going to waste her time with the charity case of a CEO with no company to run.
Turns out she was more interested in the Whitmore name than in me. Part of me wanted to feel vindicated.
But mostly I just felt sad. Sad for my son, sad for what we'd both lost.
I'm sorry, I said. Don't be. You were right about her. About everything. He wiped his eyes roughly. I came to ask, can I help?
Not as CEO, not as your heir presumptive. Just as someone who knows the business and wants to fix what he broke.
I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect anything. But if you'll let me, I'd like to try to earn back your trust.
This was what I'd wanted 3 days ago, Graham humble, asking for help, ready to work together. But now, standing in the hallway of the house we'd all shared, I realized something had changed.
I'd changed. On one condition, I said. He looked up, hopeful and terrified. You tell me the truth. About everything.
About why you made the choices you made, about what you really want from life, about whether you actually care about this company or just what it represents.
I moved closer. Because I don't need an employee, Graham. I need my son.
And I need to know if that person still exists under all the ambition and entitlement.
He nodded slowly. I don't know if I know who that person is anymore. But I'd like to find out. If you'll help me.
I thought about my ghost orchid, 12 years from cutting to bloom. About patience and persistence and the belief that something beautiful could grow from what looked broken.
Come on, I said, leading him toward the kitchen. Let's have tea.
And then you can tell me everything, starting with when you stopped seeing me as your mother and started seeing me as an obstacle.
It was going to be a long conversation. Painful, probably. Maybe impossible.
But for the first time in years, I had hoped that my son and I might find our way back to each other. Outside, the sun was setting over the greenhouse, and through the glass I could see my orchids blooming in the golden light. 3 months later, I stood in the greenhouse at dawn, checking the progress of a new cutting I'd started the week after the DOT crisis. It was thriving, new roots pushing through the growing medium, tiny leaves unfurling with that delicate resilience that always amazed me. Everything looked delicate until you understood how strong it really was. The company was stabilizing. We'd lost the Hendricks contract, as expected, and they'd sued for damages. We'd settled out of court for less than Janet predicted, and honestly, I slept better knowing we weren't compromising our standards for their business. We'd found 3 new clients, smaller contracts, better margins, relationships built on mutual respect instead of pressure and corner cutting. Graham was working in operations now, not as VP but as a senior manager reporting to Thomas Berkeley. The demotion had been hard for him, but he'd accepted it without complaint. He came to the house twice a week for dinner, and slowly, painfully slowly, we were learning how to talk to each other again. Really talk, not just exchange pleasantries while avoiding everything that mattered. He'd admitted things I'd suspected but never confirmed. That Vivian had pushed him to see me as competition for his inheritance. That he'd felt invisible next to Harold's legacy, desperate to prove himself by being more aggressive, more successful, more everything than his father. That he'd stopped seeing me as a person years ago and started seeing me as a symbol of everything he wanted to surpass. I'm sorry, Mom, he'd said during one of those dinners, tears streaming down his face. I'm so sorry for how I treated you. For the things I said. For letting Vivian mock you while I stood there and laughed. You deserved so much better. I'd held him while he cried, my middle-aged son broken and humble in a way he'd never been before. And I'd forgiven him, not because he'd earned it yet, but because I loved him. Because parents don't stop loving their children even when those children break their hearts. The department heads had warmed to me too. David Park called me Eleanor now instead of Mrs. Whitmore. Janet Reeves had admitted over coffee that she'd expected me to fail within the first week. Thomas Berkeley had started inviting me to operational meetings, genuinely asking for my input instead of just tolerating my presence. You think differently than Harold did, he told me last month. Not better or worse, just different. He saw business as a game to win.
You see it as a garden to cultivate. Both approaches have value. I'd never thought of it that way, but he was right. I did approach the business like gardening, patient attention to what needed nurturing, careful pruning of what wasn't healthy, understanding that growth took time and couldn't be rushed. And slowly, steadily, Whitmore Holdings was growing in the right direction. My phone buzzed, a text from Marcus Chun, who'd stayed on as a consultant. Board meeting at 10. Ready to present the quarterly report. I smiled. 3 months ago, the idea of presenting to the board would have terrified me. Now it just made me nervous, which felt like progress. Ready as I'll ever be, I typed back. The board meeting went better than expected. The numbers weren't spectacular, we were still recovering from the Hendricks loss and the DOT crisis, but they showed stability, showed improvement, showed that the company was heading in a sustainable direction. Mrs. Whitmore, one of the board members, said as we were wrapping up, "I'll admit I had serious doubts when you took over. But what you've accomplished in 3 months, stabilizing operations, rebuilding compliance, shifting to quality clients, that's impressive." Harold would be proud. Would he? I'd never know for sure. But I like to think so. I like to think that somewhere, somehow, Harold was watching and understood that I'd been strong all along. That the quiet woman in the greenhouse had held the foundation of his empire in her hands and never let it crumble, even when everyone dismissed her as irrelevant. After the meeting, Graham met me in the parking lot. He'd been attending board meetings as an observer, learning, rebuilding his understanding of the business from the ground up. "You did great in there," he said. "Really great." "Thanks." We walked toward our cars together. "How are you doing?" "Really doing." He was quiet for a moment. "Some days are good. Some days I wake up and can't believe I destroyed my marriage and nearly destroyed the company. But I'm figuring it out. Therapy helps. And having you back in my life helps more than anything." "I never left," I said gently. "You just stopped seeing me." "I know." He looked at me, and I saw my little boy in there somewhere, underneath the mistakes and regrets. "For what it's worth, I'm glad you fought back. Glad you didn't let me erase you. I needed someone to stop me before I destroyed everything." We stood there in the parking lot, mother and son, both of us broken in different ways but maybe healing together. "Come to dinner Sunday," I said. "I'll make that pot roast you used to love." "I'd like that." He hugged me, and I held on tight, grateful for second chances. That evening, I returned to the greenhouse as the sun set. My sanctuary, my refuge, the place where I'd always been able to think clearly. I checked each plant systematically, the orchids, the bonsais, the rare tropicals I'd been cultivating for years. The ghost orchid was still blooming, its white petals luminous in the fading light. 12 years from cutting to bloom, and now it was thriving, producing flowers that seemed impossible. "We did it," I whispered to it. "We survived." My phone buzzed one more time, an email from a business magazine requesting an interview about my unconventional path to CEO. I smiled, thinking about how they'd angle the story. Probably something about the overlooked widow who surprised everyone. The plant lady who proved she could run an empire. They'd never understand the truth, that I hadn't suddenly become strong when I claimed my inheritance. I'd been strong all along. I'd just been using that strength differently, quietly, in ways they couldn't see or value. Underestimation, I'd learned, was a gift. When people think you're weak, they let their guard down. They reveal themselves. They make mistakes. And you? You just keep growing, keep pushing roots deeper, keep preparing for the moment when you finally bloom. Harold had given me that gift when he put the business in my name, not out of love maybe, but out of gratitude or guilt, or some complicated mixture of both. He'd recognized in his way that I'd saved him once and might need to save his legacy again. And I had. Not with aggression or drama, but with patience, integrity, and the understanding that real strength doesn't always look powerful. I touched the ghost orchid's petals one more time, marveling at their delicate beauty. 12 years. 12 years of patience, care, and refusing to give up. Some things were worth the wait. As I left the greenhouse and headed back to the house, my house, earned and kept, I thought about justice. Not the loud, dramatic kind you see in movies, but the quiet kind that unfolds slowly, inevitably, like seasons changing or seeds sprouting. Graham and Vivian had tried to humiliate me at the will reading. They'd laughed at my inheritance of plants,
certain they'd won everything that mattered. But they'd forgotten that plants have roots. And roots, given time, can break through concrete. I'd built my justice slowly, patiently, one decision at a time. Not through revenge or cruelty, but through competence and integrity and the refusal to be erased from my own story. And in the end, that was the sweetest victory of all, not destroying them, but simply outlasting them. Outgrowing them. Proving that the woman they'd dismissed had been holding the foundation all along. The house was quiet as I settled in for the evening. No Vivian's cutting remarks. No Graham's arrogance. Just peace, and the satisfaction of knowing I'd saved what Harold built, not for him, not even for Graham, but for myself. Because I'd earned it. Every inch of it. With my inheritance, my patience, my quiet strength that everyone mistook for weakness. I made tea and sat by the window overlooking the greenhouse, watching the lights glow softly in the darkness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the business never stopped demanding attention. But tonight, I could rest, knowing I'd proven something important. That silence isn't weakness. That patience isn't passivity. That the woman tending roses in a greenhouse can be just as powerful as the man in a boardroom, more powerful maybe, because she understands that real growth happens slowly, carefully, with attention to roots that no one else can see. Justice doesn't need rage or drama. It just needs time. And I'd waited 50 years. What was a little longer? Outside, the ghost orchid bloomed in the darkness, beautiful and impossible and proof that underestimated things can still flourish. Just like me. If you believe that arrogance always gets what it deserves, and that patience is the strongest form of power, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another story of quiet justice and unexpected strength. Drop a comment telling us what you learned from Eleanor's story, how have you been underestimated, and how did you prove them wrong? Your story might inspire someone else who's fighting their own battle in silence. Share this video with someone who needs to remember that being quiet doesn't mean being weak, and that sometimes the greatest victories come from simply refusing to give up. We'll see you in the next story, where we'll share another tale of courage, justice, and the power of never letting anyone erase your worth. Until then, remember, like Eleanor's orchids, your strength might be invisible to others, but that doesn't make it any less real.